Trans discourse around detransition either tries to claim that detransition never happens, or that detransitioners were never truly trans to begin with. I'll first explain why these two statements are inaccurate, then I'll talk about why I don't think they would be appropriate things to say to someone who's questioning whether they should transition, even if they were true. And lastly, I'll talk about how I think about transition regret, and some strategies for you to try and make sure that your transition is a healthy one. If you spend enough time in LGBT spaces, it's obvious that people detransition. When I was in high school, I didn't identify as transgender yet, but I knew 4 people who did. Out of those 4 people, 1 of them still identifies as transgender. And given it's been like 8 years, so that's quite some time, but still, pretty high detransition rate. If you go on Twitter or Reddit, you'll see active, thriving communities with hundreds, if not thousands, of detransitioners. When I was questioning whether I should transition, I made a blank Twitter account where I followed a ton of detransitioners, everyone that I could find, and I was following hundreds. They had very different stories, they were very different individuals, but they were all definitely real people and definitely had detransitioned. Often when trying to claim that detrans people are incredibly rare, trans people are not pointing to the accounts of these people, because clearly when you hear someone talking about their experience as a detransitioner, they do exist. The first study I'll talk about, I'm gonna butcher these authors' names. Davies, McIntyre, and Ripma. So these authors get a less than 0.1% detransition rate that I see thrown around a lot. But how did they get this? They have patient intake reports from a gender clinic. So these are people who are actively seeking gender-related care, and then they scan the text of these reports for people who mention regret. I don't think that they were claiming that this is a population-level detransition statistic, but clearly this method of scanning the text of people who are continuing to seek gender care is not the best way to find out people who have stopped seeking gender-related care, who have stopped transitioning. That statistic is not what you think it is. It is not saying that 0.1% of people detransition. It's saying 0.1% of people who are actively in gender-related care mention regret to their caretaker. So, that's a pretty specific statement. Other studies have very high dropout rates. A study by Smith et al. From 2005 starts out with 325 transgender adults, and then by the time that they are evaluating the success of treatment, less than half of those adults have remained in the study. Some never started hormones, and some just dropped out. So we don't know what happened to those dropouts. Did they detransition? Did they just lose touch and have better things to do than follow up with these researchers? We have no idea, and it's such a high dropout rate that we just cannot say anything conclusively about a 1% detransition rate or what have you. The last research study I'll talk about specifically is the one that I see discussed the most in trans spaces, which comes from the US Transgender Survey. Off the bat, the problem with this you can hear in the name, which is it's from the US Transgender Survey. They are not keeping up with people who have detransitioned and are presumably not involved in trans spaces. So even still, they get a pretty high detransition rate. So they have 8% of these trans people surveyed have a history of detransition, which I think is pretty crazy. And a lot of trans people will try to soften this by saying that most of these detransitions are reported as temporary or due to transphobia, lack of medical care, or other sort of factors that we think of as not because you weren't truly trans. But even still, it's a pretty serious detransition rate, 8%. For those people who are detransitioning and then retransitioning, that's a pretty traumatic experience to go through. So even though this survey has only focused on people who identify as transgender, I don't think that the results are that strong on detransition never happens. There are many studies that I have not discussed besides these 3 that have problems with them, they count only people who legally changed all their documents, then legally changed them all back, or these studies are from the 90s when transition was way less prevalent, or they only document people who went to pursue detransition related surgeries from the same surgeon that they originally went to, which is of course many detransition people decide to try to accept their bodies as they are and would really not pursue any further modifications to their bodies. So we don't know from these studies that detransition is extremely rare or that it doesn't happen. In fact, it does happen, and it's probably not extremely rare. That's what we'd expect. Transition is in part an identity choice and in part a medical treatment. Medical treatments don't work for every person. Similarly, people's identities change over the course of their life. That makes sense, that's natural. Some people are gonna detransition. That's just the way of life. And we shouldn't be trying to claim that there's a less than 1% detransition rate. There just isn't. Don't say that. If you spend time in detrans spaces just listening and watching, as I did for a very long time, you'll see that there's no one detrans narrative, just as there's no one trans narrative. Some detransitioners were hardcore, true scum transmed types who had crippling dysphoria and were so disheartened by the fact that they could never become, cisgender that they decided to just detransition. Some detrans people were more too cute types who didn't experience a ton of dysphoria, who took their decision too casually maybe, and who hadn't looked into all the effects of HRT. And there's everyone in between. Saying that the second someone detransitions, they were never trans to begin with, is the no true Scotsman. Life is complex. Transition might be the right thing for a very long time in someone's life, and then things might change, and it might no longer. And that's totally fair. I think it's fair for someone to identify who's detransitioned as saying they're still trans, or saying that they were trans, but now are no longer trans, or saying that they were never trans to begin with. I think that's their personal call to make. So just to give an example as to how messy this can get, I'll describe one sort of hypothetical person, but this is a narrative that I have seen in detrans spaces that feels quite common. So imagine someone who has experienced a ton of physical dysphoria. They really have hated their chest since as long as they can remember. They think through it carefully, they socially transition at first, and then they decide to start medically transitioning. They have top surgery, they take testosterone, and for a while they're quite happy. They really have liked living in this role as a trans man where they're obviously masculine and they're like sort of passing, but they don't necessarily look cisgender yet, and they don't look straight. This person is only attracted to women, so they know that they're ultimately trying to live as a straight guy, and they're happy about that. They think that's really going to work for them. But then at some point, they hit year 2, year 3 of testosterone, and they really pass. They pass as a straight cis guy, and they didn't realize how alienating that was going to feel for them, and how serious and intense the ties that they had felt to the lesbian community had been, and how alone they feel now. And now that they're really living it as a straight guy in society, they realize they aren't really one. They did have physical dysphoria, and their transition really did help with their physical dysphoria, but socially they're somewhere in between. So they decide to stop testosterone and socially go back to living as a lesbian. But even still, things are complex. They love their deep voice, they love their top surgery results, and when they're alone with their partner, as many butch lesbians have done for decades and decades and decades, they have their partner call them he, him, and call them her boyfriend. In public, they go by she, her, and totally are, trying to be seen as a woman, but, they have this sort of nuanced relationship with their gender. How does this person identify? Well, it really depends on the person. You might have a label in your mind that this person might use, but there are lots of labels that this type of person might use. So they might identify as a detransitioned woman, they might identify as a dysphoric lesbian, they might identify as just butch, not butch woman, just butch, they might identify as a genderqueer dyke, they might identify as a non-binary lesbian, they might identify as trans, detrans cusp, they might identify as transmasculine, they might identify as just female, if they don't feel comfortable with any sort of gender descriptors, they're like, I'm just female. They might identify as just a lesbian. Really, they might identify as anything. And this person might say that they are transgender but have chosen to detransition and live as a woman. They might say that they're just dysphoric. They might say that they were transgender but are no longer transgender. They might say that they were never transgender but were always a dysphoric lesbian. And I think any of those things are fine, any of those things are valid, and I don't think it's our place to say whether that person is transgender, was never transgender. And a lot of detransitioners look like this. They took their decision very seriously, it was one of the most important choices in their life, and things just didn't pan out as they'd expected. Who can blame them? You don't know the way that life is going to take you. You can't know with certainty that transition is going to work, and, they made the best choices for themselves, and it just didn't work as they'd expected. So a lot of detrans people were transgender, maybe still are transgender, but just didn't feel like transition worked. And so, I guess all in all, we know that we don't know that detransition never happens, and detrans people don't necessarily look all that different from us. They just didn't have the same results as we had, the same happiness with their transition. So maybe at this point, if you're someone who's questioning whether you should transition or is doubting your transition, you're feeling a bit scared. The studies don't say that less than 1% of people will detransition, and detrans people were not these glaringly obvious cisgender transgenders. What does that mean for you? It does mean that we can't know for sure if transition is going to work for us. Even some people who are detrans who knew about the concept of detransition when they were choosing to transition, who were incredibly confident in their choice to transition, even some of those people detransition, right? Like, there's no way, before you actually go through the experience of transition, up until the point that you die, there's no way that you can guarantee that your whole life you're never going to detransition, and that transition will always be the right choice for you. So where do we go from here? Well, I don't think that claiming that detransition never happens or that detrans people were never trans, I don't think that these points are the right way to talk to someone who's questioning about a major life choice, as it is. So to make my point, I'm going to talk about another major life choice. So let's consider marriage. I think that marriage is one of the most serious choices you can make in your life. When you choose to have kids with someone, you are like really bound to that person for a very long time, right? Like, you know, that person can end up abusive, you can hate them, but you might still have to talk with them for your whole life. I mean, marriage has like legal consequences, social consequences, it has consequences about your autonomy, about your finances. It's a huge deal. So let's say you're talking to a friend and you're saying, okay, hello friend, my wedding's coming up and I'm getting cold feet. I don't know if I should marry this person. So imagine that person turns back to you and says, oh, well, you know, marriage has a 50% failure rate, so I don't think that you should get married. I mean, that's a pretty high failure rate. Okay, that would be a pretty weird thing to say, right? And let's say that 10 years goes by and you go to the same friend because you haven't learned your lesson, and you want to get some comfort, and you say, you know, hey, I went through a divorce. And that friend goes to you and says, well, I mean, if you divorced your spouse, that means you must have never loved them from the start, right? Like, so that's really a win because you were never in love. And then you say, no, I mean, I was in love and I knew them and it was a serious choice, and like, you know, I'm so grateful for a lot of things marriage gave me. I'm grateful we had these beautiful kids together. I'm grateful for our home. I'm grateful for the past 10 years. We just fell out of love, and you know, that happens sometimes. And then that person goes, oh, I mean, it must have been a huge mistake, biggest mistake of your life. I mean, you never loved them, you made the choice casually. At least please don't talk about, like, you know, your marriage and how it fell apart, because like us real married people, it really hurts the way that people view marriage, right? If you imply that marriage can fail, and you say, no, again, I'm like happy that I was married, it was the right choice for some time, I'm happy with a lot of the experience, I don't want to be married to my spouse anymore, right? So at this point, this friend is kind of like an asshole. This is like not the right way to talk to someone on either front. The same goes for transition. This is where we should distinguish between the idea of detransition and transition regret. In the case of this example, this divorced person didn't regret their marriage. They were happy with their marriage for some time, and it was the right choice for a while, and then it stopped being the right choice. No regrets. Some people remain married and have regrets about being in a marriage. Some people get divorced and really regret, like their partner made them worse in a lot of ways, and they regret that they ever married that partner. And the same is true for transition. There are some trans people who do regret their transitions. They just choose to continue living as trans even though they're unhappy with their choice. And there are some detrans people who regret that they ever transitioned, and there are some detrans people who are really happy for what transition gave them. We should care a lot more about preventing transition regret than we should about preventing detransition. So it's worth mentioning, why is the reason that the way we talk about detransition is so different than the way we talk about divorce? Well, it's obviously because of transphobia, right? Transition is viewed as a hugely taboo, hugely stigmatized choice. And so admitting that a choice that no one wanted you to make didn't pan out is really embarrassing, it's really disheartening. Whereas you're so pushed by society to get married. It's more embarrassing to be 50 and never having been married than to be divorced. Getting divorced is like seen as like no big deal, or I mean, it is a big deal and it's very serious to a lot of people, but certainly not with the degree of shame that detransition bears with it. Even though detransition, because of transphobia, carries a lot of shame, I think that I would recommend you to focus on just trying to minimize transition regret, which is the only thing you really have in control. Because how do you know that in 40 years you're not going to wake up and just be like, oh, you know, I guess I want to detransition, I guess transition isn't working. You can't know that. You cannot know with 100% certainty what you're going to want in 40 years. You can just make the best choice possible today. And if you're making the best choice possible today, it's hard to have transition regret. So, what are the ways to minimize transition regret? I would break it into 3 categories. You should be making a well-informed, forward-thinking, and healthy choice. What does well-informed mean? That means really being aware of the consequences of any choice that you're making with regards to transition. So unfortunately, because trans healthcare is so understudied, that means doing the role partially of being your own doctor, right? So you have to learn all the effects that medical transition is going to have on you, learn about the risks, be thoughtful, and be on top of your own health. So I know in my own case, I have to remind my own doctor that I need to get my blood work done. And it's important for me to do that. I need to do that. Yeah, so you should be well informed about the choices you're making. The next is forward thinking. You're gonna have to, you're signing up to live your life as a trans person. You're not just completing a transition, boom, it's done, you don't need to think about it anymore. You need to think about the way that transition is gonna interplay with your future. Like, what's it gonna like to be, if you wanna be a parent, what's that gonna look like for you? If you wanna marry, what's that gonna look like for you? If what does growing old as a trans person look like for you? You should be thoughtful about all those things. I know in my own case, that meant that I chose to freeze my eggs because I didn't want to just push down the road what would having kids look like for me. And I knew having biological kids was important to me, and so I wanted to be forward thinking about that and not just push that off. And then the last point here, making healthy choices, having a healthy transition. This is the one that I'm going to spend a lot of time on because this is a very nuanced and difficult topic. A common narrative around detransitioners who do not regret their transition is that they feel that transition allowed them to live a healthier and a happier life and ultimately put them on the right path. So for some people, what that looked like is they chose to transition when they were in a really deep hole in life. They were really suicidal, they hated their body, they hated their life, and transition allowed them to get therapy, support, it allowed them to feel that they had control over their future, and it really got them out of that rut. Now that they detransitioned, they don't identify as transgender anymore, but they're happy that they chose to transition because they're alive today, and they might have not been if they weren't allowed to transition. Even if that person doesn't still identify as transgender, I think that's a huge win for transition. On the other hand, a common narrative around people who regret their transition and have detransitioned is that they felt that transition was unhealthy, almost like a form of self-harm for those people. So what that looked like for some people is they felt like transition was analogous to their eating disorders, that they would do things like binding, like taking testosterone, like, self-hatred while looking in the mirror, all those things from the perspective of being very angry with their bodies, being very both dysphoric and dysmorphic, being searching for something that was unattainable and really pushing themselves deeper and deeper into a dysphoric spiral. So they make comparisons to, say, online pro-anorexia communities, which foster more eating disorder style behavior, to their experiences of being in online transgender communities. And so it makes sense that if you felt like transitioning and being in online transgender spaces increased your dysphoria, made you have more body self-hatred, encourage your eating disorder, ultimately felt like self-harm, that you would regret your transition, because that sounds like a regrettable time. Or similarly, I saw someone who described their transition was inherently interwoven with a time where they were on drugs, working as a sex worker, and this was unwanted work as a sex worker. They associate their transition with being addicted and with being in poverty and in pain, and ultimately also with not searching for the one thing that mattered the most to them, which was how they could have biological children. They just kept on pushing that off and not thinking about the ways in which their medical transition interplayed with their fertility. So it makes sense that that person would also regret their transition, because it doesn't sound like the transition was a good time. Some detrans people will explain their dysphoria after the fact as having originated from an external source. So that could be anything. It could be from homophobia, it could be from sexism, it could be from sexual abuse, it could be from child abuse, it could be from depression, it could be from an eating disorder. Really anything that makes you feel like you hate yourself or hate your body could be the cause of dysphoria. Some trans people, and even myself included actually in the past, will encourage people who are questioning whether they're trans to try to prod into whether their dysphoria also might come from one of these external sources. But I've kind of questioned this now, and I do not think I would recommend this now to someone who's wanting to know whether they should transition. Why would I not recommend you try to see if your dysphoria comes from one of these sources? Well, okay, I would, I guess, but I wouldn't recommend you look into the source of your dysphoria for the sake of determining are you truly trans or not. First of all, I wouldn't recommend this because I think it's not going to be productive, which I'll explain. But then secondly, I've gained a better understanding of the history of conversion therapy. So I know that this is a bit of a controversial subject, but I think that trying to explain your gender nonconformity or your transness as originating from many traumas really is reminiscent to the, the good old days of conversion therapy for, gay, lesbian, and bisexual kids. I read this excellent book, which is called The Miseducation of Cameron Post. It is a fiction book, yes, but the authors really researched conversion therapy. In the section where the protagonist is attending conversion therapy, there's a long amount of time where the characters have to come up with the, iceberg of where their same-sex attraction comes from. So on the top of the iceberg, they would put, same-sex attraction, and then beneath it, they'd be like, what are the true causes? And it's, basically all the same stuff you see people attributing their gender dysphoria, or really their gender nonconformity, to originate from, which is, bad relationship with your parents, sexual abuse, sexism in society, all that same stuff, eating disorder, depression, all of it attributed to same-sex attraction. And we would never encourage anyone to do that these days. I think the way it gets complex is that it is true these different factors can increase people's gender dysphoria. And it is true that some people are confusing these different traumas with gender dysphoria. That's all true. If you approach looking into these very serious and very complex issues, which every person has faced, if you've just lived in society, you've experienced sexism, you've experienced homophobia, setting some sort of bar of you have to have all of those things be clear, no mental health issues to transition, no one's gonna meet that ever. But if you approach these questions from am I truly trans or not, you're never gonna get anything out of that. You'll always be on the defensive mode. This is why I am in favor of informed consent for hormones, because all the time I'll see people talking about how they have to be reserved with their therapists because their therapists are gatekeeping them to the hormones that they really need. And so they can't actually make progress on these serious issues because they don't want to be denied and they don't want to admit that they do have other things going on. I would really recommend you work on your mental health and you work on your history with trauma, because it's important, because it will make you feel better, because it will make your transition happier and healthier. Not just because it might influence whether you ultimately choose to transition. There's a wide spectrum of how happy trans people are in the trans community. You'll see some people who pass perfectly great and they say, great, my transition's done, I feel happy, I feel awesome, I love all the medical procedures I've had, and I'm just so happy I was able to transition. And then you'll see other people who, are still happy they transitioned, of course, but who are posting in, say top surgery forums and are like, does my left nipple look half a millimeter too big? And this person is bearded, is so passing, they're just covered in hair, and they're like, I don't know, I think my chest looks female. And no one can see anything female about it, but they still clearly are sort of entangled in these dysphoric feelings that still have a very complex relationship with their body. People want to have happy transitions, and trans people have different levels of happiness with the transition. So I would argue that working on yourself, working on your mental health, working on your relationship with sexism, with homophobia, with trauma, all those things might make you just a happier trans person. It won't cure the gender dysphoria out of you. It won't make you not gender nonconforming. It won't make you fit into what your parents always expected, but it might make you just a happier, healthier person. For that right alone, it's worth spending some time on. So, okay, well, how do you address these things? Okay, it's complex, of course. To give an example of what this might look like, it might be that you have an eating disorder and you're trans. You decide you're gonna get a therapist and you're gonna spend some time working on your eating disorder. You're still trans by the end of it, you still wanna go on testosterone, you still want top surgery, you haven't beaten the gender nonconformity out of you, but when you go on testosterone, you're not freaking out about the weight gain that you have when you grow some muscle. You're more comfortable in your body. Your dysphoria is lower. It hasn't changed the fact that you wanna transition. You still want to transition, but it has made you feel more comfortable in your body. In my own case, I have OCD, and working on my OCD with my therapist has made my dysphoria less. OCD makes me, in part, feel hyper-aware of my body, and so the fact that I already have some sort of pre-existing dysphoria, it amplifies it, right? I'm thinking a lot about the parts of my body that don't look exactly how I like them to look. And then when my OCD is better, I'm not thinking as much about it. I'm still dysphoric, and I still I'm still on testosterone, I'm still happily socially transitioned, all those things, but I'm better and I'm happier. And so I think that when people talk about reducing dysphoria through non-transitional methods, they're often not coming at it from good faith. They're often hoping that you'll turn out this perfectly conforming person. But no, from a good faith standpoint, working on this stuff might reduce your dysphoria. And maybe this will end up with you being like, oh my god, I don't identify as transgender. But probably not, but maybe. And in that case, that's cool, you'll learn that. And in the case that, say you learn that in the middle of your transition, well, that's really valuable information, and you have seriously improved your life, right? So in this case of these people who had serious depression, were really suicidal, they worked on their mental health, then they no longer felt the need to identify as transgender, I mean, great, they fixed their depression. That's awesome. So, you know, sort of no matter what the outcome is, if you're working on happy and healthy things, life gets better. And I think when people say, go to a therapist, and I felt this too, it's sort of like, what does that mean? I mean, come on. So some of you might have never been to a therapist, or might have not had a good relationship with a therapist. A therapist is really excellent. It's not just like a cop-out suggestion, it's a real suggestion. So what's so great about a therapist is that some of these thoughts are really hard to parse out. So let's say I have dysphoria around my hips, right? I don't have an eating disorder personally, but hypothetically, let's say I did. The thoughts won't ever be as clean-cut as, oh my god, I hate my hips because my brain is male and, you know, I am a male but in a female body and that's why I hate them. Or, I hate my hips because I have an eating disorder and my hips make me look fat and that's why I hate them. It won't be that clear. It will be this muddled feeling, it will be just an emotion, and you really can't parse out what's going on, what combination of these things. But a therapist who's trained in these things, who's listening to you, who is cool with trans people, but is not, who's just a neutral observer, right? Can listen to this and have a better sense as to what's going on and offer some real suggestions. And all the time my therapist will say these things and I'm like, oh my god, I can't believe you know more about me than I know about myself. And it's incredible. You can make a lot of progress as a therapist. Okay, but there are still things I think you can do even if you're not in the place to see a therapist. So a big one is thinking about the media, TV, movies, and books that you're exposing yourself to. A lot of detransitioners talk about, and I guess specifically the female to male to female detransitioners, that they wish they'd seen more butch women portrayed in a positive light. I think you should spend some time looking at butch women portrayed in a positive light. Even if you end up being the most binary trans male ever, it's really valuable to work on these feelings of internalized homophobia that I think almost all of us have. What would I recommend? I loved reading this. It's this magazine that you can find online. I think I had to pay for it, but it's just beautiful. It's called Butch is Not a Dirty Word, and it has these photographs and life stories of a lot of butch people. This includes butch people who are confident in their womanhood, transgender women who are butches, non-binary people who are butches, all sorts of butch people displaying masculinity. Again, I don't, at the end of the day, identify as a butch person, but I thought it was really cool to kind of connect with my broader community of people who are assigned female but are now very masculine. And I think it's important because a lot of us who are trans men or trans masculine people, one of the first steps in our transition, we're going to be read as lesbians. I mean, that's everyone's been through that, right? And it's a lot easier to get through this stage if you're cool with lesbians. So what do I mean by that? Obviously, I get that when you want to pass as male, it sucks when people are reading you as female. But I'll see in trans spaces people talk about someone reading them as a lesbian in a way that is clearly clouded by lesbophobia. People will comment on people who are asking if they're passing and being that looks too lesbian, or ugly lesbian, or only lesbians wear those nose rings. Just stuff that's you know it when you see it. You're that is people who are those people are biased against lesbians. I would also recommend reading things that portray trans people, gender non-conforming people, non-binary people in a positive light, in a neutral light. It can be a huge deal. So I have this giant collection of trans books that I'm going to be talking about, and again, they feature trans people. They also do feature people who identify not as trans, but who experience gender differently than the average person. I think that normalizing your own gender nonconformity can be a huge part to accepting who you are. I also recommend looking into whatever you're passionate about. Find people who are gender nonconforming or trans who are into that as well. So a big deal for me was finding that there's a scientist whose name was Ben Bars, who is a trans man. It was really cool reading his writings of his transition and also his time in academia, because I'm also someone who's in academia and who's a trans man, and it was cool to see that there had been someone like me before. I also love, as stupid as it's gonna sound, I watched this show called Are You the One?, which is a dating show, and it was the first time they had a trans masculine person on the show. It was the first time I had seen a trans masculine person portrayed as sexually desirable ever. And I mean, he was a total wreck. His sexual desirability was kind of complex, got him into a lot of drama, but it was such an emotional experience seeing someone like me in that light. So actively search out kinds of media and books and representation that shows you to a broad range of people. I actively look for still not just trans men, but also non-binary people, because I know that I definitely have a lot of sort of biases against non-binary people, because it came to my awareness as a trans person in, I don't know, 2014 or something was when I first started to think I was transgender, and the attitudes around non-binary people then were not great. I think my earliest trans consciousness was coded in these media that treated non-binary people quite negatively. If I were to ever identify as non-binary, I just want to make sure that I'm not so biased into believing that I must be a binary trans man that I'm neglecting that possibility. Because I all the time I see people who end up identifying as non-binary that just never consider that as a possibility for themselves. So you never know the way your biases might land. You might have it go the other way, right? Where people are so transphobic in your area that you think it's most likely that you'll identify as a butch lesbian, but then in exposing yourselves to positive trans media, it flips and you realize, oh my god, no, I actually do identify as a trans man. So I think just see positive portrayals of people all across this sort of gender spectrum, and it will help your transition, it will help you know what you want. I would also make sure that you have some passions that are not related to transition. Some detransitioners who regret their transition talk about the time they were transitioning as being very isolated, that they spent it holed up in their room, having dropped out of school, not working a job, just smoking weed, not talking with people, and it makes sense you'd regret that time in your life. On the other hand, if you're not sure about your transition, but you make sure that your transition is spent that you're enrolled in university, studying something you love, that you're working a job you're excited about, that you're making art, that you're playing music, that you're coding, whatever it is that inspires you, that you're doing something that isn't just transition, then it's more likely that your reflection on your time spent transitioning, whether it's because you're an old, wise trans person or because you end up detransitioning, that you'll have a positive outlook on that time if you spent it doing something you're passionate about. It also sets you up well because I will see people in the trans community who talk about, I'm done with my transition, now what? I spent my whole life sort of planning for top surgery and I just had top surgery, and that's great, I don't feel dysphoria, but I just don't know what comes next. If you make sure that you have passions throughout your transition, you can have a smoother path into normal life after you're done with your transition. The last thing I'm going to talk about is a bit controversial, but I hope it might be useful for you. So when people talk about social influences on dysphoria, they are often not coming at it from good faith. The literature on rapid onset gender dysphoria is hogwash, it's terrible, don't read it, but I do think that it is a real thing and that you should think about what community you're in and how people are making you feel about your body and the language they're using around your body. Again, not from the sake of that you wouldn't identify as trans if you were in a different community, you would, but from the sake of you might be a happier trans person if you're surrounding yourself with good people. So let's say specifically, there's been a lot of discourse these days recently about trans medicalism and how that ideology really promotes a self-hatred talk. And I think that's real. I see that trans spaces, right? People being you're not really trans unless you shower in the dark. You might have not showered in the dark, but now be tempted to shower in the dark because you heard you aren't valid unless you've done that. And I'll see people in trans groups on Reddit who use really strong language. So I will see people make memes about wanting to get breast cancer so that they can have top surgery. It's not how breast cancer works. You don't want cancer. Or I will see people use language around their hips and places where they're female coded where fat is that is just really bad, and they'll introduce this to other people who might have not seen that language before. So these are people who are trans, who are dysphoric, who will almost certainly have a really happy, successful transition, but who might be less happy having had all this new language to talk negatively about their body. So, you should reflect on are you happier in the spaces that you're in? Are you happier in the communities you're in? Is that working out for you? So, in my case, I just don't follow the communities on Reddit that I think promote this negative self-talk. I'm not on trans Twitter, which I view as I just personally, it doesn't make me feel better being on trans Twitter. And I follow people on YouTube who make me feel happy. I don't follow the trans medical people. And the people the trans individuals who I talk with one-on-one, we have very healthy, mature relationships. So I talk with one person, he's also a PhD student, so I talk with him about his research. I talk with another person, she's trying to get a full-time job in finance, and I talk with her about that and about her friends and her desire to date. And I talk with another person about like writing and like, you know, like sort of creative writing about trans bodies. I find that from those interactions, I walk away feeling better about myself, more clear in my role as a trans person, and I don't get sucked into this sort of toxic language around self-hatred. And this comes up in detrans spaces as well. So I would not recommend you look at detrans spaces, not just because I think detransitioners deserve their own space, but also because it introduces new language to talk about your body. So I will see some detransitioners when I was in these spaces, which again I do largely regret, but who want a community, understandably, and who don't regret their transition, but they get introduced to this world on Twitter where people are describing top surgery as mutilation, where people are like, of course you regretted it, talking about the trans ideology, and these people are like, no, I don't feel that. But then once you see it over and over again, you're like, I guess I did mutilate myself, even if you never felt that in the first place. And I really hate that I got some of that language in my brain, right? It's like, as I said, mutilation. I'm gonna try to not name a bunch of these things because I don't want to get into your brain as well. But yeah, the words and the communities that use them really do have an impact on your dysphoria, and so you should just be thoughtful about who you're talking with and how they make you feel. So as a closing note, I have to mention, of course, that the reason we're talking about detransition so much these days is because of transphobia. Unfortunately, many detransitioners, though definitely not all, probably not the majority even, but some detransitioners and a vocal few support transphobic policies. So most notably, we have Kira Bell in the UK, who's suing the NHS. I get why this is really frustrating for trans people, and I get why this makes us want to push them out of our community. It's horrible when they back transphobic policies, but I want to offer at least sort of a plea for empathy. Put yourself in their shoes, truly. Just think about it for 1 second. Imagine what it's like to have suffered gender dysphoria very severely for a very long time and have been told by everyone that transition would work, it would make you feel better, and it would be great. And then it didn't work for you. Imagine how hard that would feel, and how like embarrassing and sad. And imagine how tempted you would be to assume that's the case for everyone. I think everyone wants to assume that their life experience is the universal one. It's like a common human flaw. It's in part why I think trans people are so suspicious of detransitioners, because our, transition worked great, so why do these other people not have their transition work great? And so, they're no different than us. They want to believe that every person will regret their transition. I mean, that's not the case, but I'm sympathetic to why some of those people would feel that. And over time, people's views change. I've watched detransitioners go through these evolutions, right, where they, at first they feel, oh my god, everyone must regret their transition like I do, and then they realize that's not the case, and maybe they even have more nuanced views about their own gender. And I think expecting someone to have something not turn out well for them and immediately be supportive of trans people and immediately be super pro-transition, it's just a really hard position. So I think you gotta give people space. But then also, when we say things like detransition never happens, it's very rare, most of those accounts are fake accounts, those people are lying, they never transitioned, or detrans people are cisgender trans trenders, they were never trans to begin with, why do these cisgender people speak about trans issues? When you say those things, it pushes detrans people away. It pushes those marginal people who wanted a community, who feel really complex feelings about their gender, about their body, who need still someone to talk to. It pushes them right into the hands of gender critical people who are really ready to provide that affirmation that people need. And so, I see it all the time. I saw it on Twitter. There's one detransitioner named Kai Shevers who now identifies as transmasculine, but uses she, her pronouns, I believe. So she talks about how seductive it is as someone when you're having doubts about your transition to fall into this sort of ideology. When we dismiss people who are having doubts about their transition, who are detransitioning, tell them that they are just cisgender people, we're just confused. When we dismiss them, we push them right into the claws of gender critical people and right into that ideology. I think it's really important for us to be empathetic, for us to be understanding about the fact that some of these people might have complex feelings about their transition, complex feelings about transition in general, and to be open to speaking with them and to listen, to give them their space, to not talk over them, and to not say things like, I'm cool with detrans people except when they do X. I mean, because that language, when people say, I'm cool with trans people except when they're so showy, I'm cool with gay people except when they make it their whole identity, I'm cool with black people except, no, not a cool thing to say. Don't say I'm cool with detrans people except when you're transphobic, just say I'm cool with detrans people, right? Like, and then say I'm not cool with transphobia, but this language matters, the way we treat people matters, and it does have impacts on the way that detrans people talk about the trans community. And that is politically relevant, right? So both for the sake of being a decent human being and treating people who have had the same experience as us of complex body dysphoria, all that stuff feelings, treating them with empathy, but also, even selfishly for our own sake, we need to be empathetic to detransitioners. So that's where we're at. Detransition does happen, and not every detransitioner made a mistake. Some made the best decision given the information available to them at the time. It just didn't pan out. And that's the standard you should hold yourself to. You should make informed, forward-looking, healthy choices, not just because it might help you realize if you should transition, but also because it will make your life better as a trans person. Gender is hard, and we're all doing our best.